Johnny's aunt passed away, and so they'll be gone this weekend to attend the memorial service, graveside service there in Missouri. So I want to remember them as they travel and hope that the weather holds up and cooperates a little bit. And Ginger was admitted to the hospital with a broken femur. And the first CT scan didn't indicate the stroke, but the one they did down in Hutch did indicate a massive stroke. And so they sent her back here to put her on hospice at the hospital here. And so they've been taking good care of her at the hospital. A lot of good people who know her and love her, and so it was a good place to go. Genesis chapter 17. By the way, I have the sheets there for next week, but I forgot to change the title. It says Lesson 5, but I forgot to change the rest of it, and so it still says Abraham, Isaac, Sodom, and Abimelech, and so it makes no sense. So I crossed that out, and you can write in there Abraham the end, because that's when Abraham gets closer to the end of his time. In chapter 17, God appears to Abram when he is how old? When Abram is how old? 99 years old. And once again, God affirms that promise that he has made to him, that blessing. And it occurs many times to Abraham in different forms. Here God says that he will establish his covenant, a covenant between the two, and he will multiply him exceedingly. And then in verse 4 it says that he will be the father of multitude of nations, again at the end of verse 5. And so God just repeats his promise, his blessing to Abram when he is 99 years old. As we've mentioned, that blessing includes a whole lot of descendants, and the only catch being that he has 0. And he's tried in chapter 15 to get God to accept one of his relatives as his heir, and God said, no, it's going to actually be your descendant. And so in chapter 16, Sarah and Abraham help God by giving him Hagar so that they can have a child that really is his child, and maybe God will be able to work with that. And that doesn't work either. And so in chapter 17, even after Abram's proposal to take his relative, and after Abram and Sarah's attempt to help God out, God repeats his promise to make him exceedingly fruitful. And it's there in chapter 17, verse 5, that the name is actually changed from Abram to Abraham. And do some of you have a little note in your margin that says what those two words mean, Abram and Abraham? Abram, that's the second one, the Abraham. Exalted father. Abram means exalted father, and so he's an important patriarch. He's an exalted guy, but he can't be called the father of a multitude yet until he gets closer to the fulfillment of the child. It's kind of like you don't have a Tom Jones Sr. until you have a Tom Jones Jr. And so he cannot be the father of a multitude if he has 0 children. And so God changes his name here just as evidence of what's going to happen. In the rest of this chapter, he gives Abraham the covenant of circumcision, and he makes it their eternal covenant between God and all of the males, Israelite males. And he points out that in verse 12 and 13, that the same rule is going to apply to anybody, even if they are outsiders, aliens, who are in his household. And so God expects other people who are living in the same area and associated with him to observe the same laws. Even later in Numbers chapter 15, when God is giving the law to the Israelites, in Numbers chapter 15, beginning in verse 14 down through verse 16, God explains that any alien, any foreigner living in their midst is expected to obey the same law, to obey God's law. And Numbers 15:16 says, there's to be one law and one ordinance for you and for the alien who sojourns with you. And so God expected everybody in that care to follow one law, the single law. And so Abraham did that. And Abraham was 99, and how old was Ishmael? He's 13 in verse 25. Back in verse 15, in the midst of this chapter about circumcision, what does God say to Abraham? I changed your name. I'm going to change her name too. It was Sarai, and I'm going to change it to Sarah, and Sarah means princess. Shall be her name. And that was also because she was going to be the mother of nations and the mother of kings. What was Abraham's reaction when God says that?
Could you imagine having to change your name after 100 years?
Yeah, can you? I mean, I've done fine with this for 99 years. Why do I have to learn? I can't even remember my other name at this age, and so he has to learn a whole new name. But you see the importance of names in the Bible, that they go beyond just what someone is called to who they are. And that's a good point. I mean, that's a little bit late in life to be changing your name, but God is making a significant transition in Abram's life. He's gone 99 years and still hadn't seen the fulfillment of this promise. And God is indicating, okay, now the time has come. I wonder how impatient we sometimes become for God to do something in our time. And we start coming up with solutions like Abram did. You know, let's try this. And God said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Okay, let's try this. And God said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. And then Abram says, well, I'm 99 years old and it's just too late. And God said, nope. Did you make a motion, Chuck?
I was just going to say, it's kind of a side note here, but God has already informed them that there's going to be kings coming along
Yep.
later on.
Yeah, and that's interesting that it specifically mentions not only being a mother of nations, but the mother of kings. That her descendants will be kings. And of course, they are. Through David and Solomon and so forth on down the line. And I guess Saul too, for that matter, because they're all part of her family. You know, a good auctioneer always has spotters, and you have to keep your eye on Chuck because he starts to make a motion, and you just have to catch it because he always has a good. In fact, he found out how old Sarah and Abraham were when they got married. He made that one up, but he did find out some information about Esther. Was it you found out about her age when someone said what she was how old? 14. Some expert determined that she was 14. And did it have a birthday?
Yeah,
They had the year that she was born and the year she died and how old she was when she was taken into the king. And I'm glad somebody worked that out for us. I think Chuck worked out the ages of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham just has an interesting reaction, doesn't he? What does he do? What's that? Yeah, he fell down and laughed. He fell on his face and laughed. What else are you going to do? You're 99 years old and you're going to have a kid. You can either laugh or cry. Yeah, your wife is 89, and you're going to have a child.
I think it's interesting. God tells Abraham,
Now, not Hagar, not somebody else. And the interesting thing is, this is not his last child. Johnny?
I think it's interesting that, I know I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves, but why is it that Abraham laughs and doesn't get in trouble, and Sarah laughs and she gets in trouble?
I wondered that same thing. So we'll try to figure that out when we get there. I have one solution. It may not be the right one, but I have one answer to it. Okay. Do you want to give it to us now? Or you want to wait till we get there?
No, because she lied. It wasn't the fact that she laughed, I don't think. It was the fact that she lied about it.
Yeah, because when they said, "Why did you laugh?" she said, "I didn't laugh." And they said, "Oh, yes, you did." And so I think maybe that might be the answer to that Abraham laughed, but he probably fessed up to it because he thought it was funny. But she tried to hide it, and I think that was probably the one possible explanation. In chapter 18, it says, "Who appears to Abraham?" The Lord appears to him while he's sitting in the tent door during the heat of the day. And Abraham looks up, and what does he see? 3 men standing right on the other side of him, and they come up and meet him, and he bows down to the earth. And what is his request? He wants them to stop. Don't keep on going. Don't pass me by and keep on going. And what's the first thing that he does? Yeah, he wants water so he can wash their feet. And so the first thing he does is he shows that honor, that service, that hospitality by washing their feet. And he suggested they rest under the tree. In the meantime, what did he do? He goes to prepare a meal, and he gives instruction for the making of bread for Sarah to make bread. Then he personally goes to the herd and picks out a calf and gives it to his servant to prepare it. How long does it take to butcher a calf and get it ready? This is probably not a 15-minute process. I was wondering about the microwave part of it. If they had some kind of microwave, they could stick it in there and speed up the whole deal. To show this kind of hospitality was a tremendous effort. You know, he didn't just grab something out of the freezer, toss it in the microwave, thaw it, and call it good. Teresa? They would have to have bled it, I'm sure, to drain the blood out of it and gone through the whole process of slaughtering it and preparing it and everything. And so, you know, it's not a snap your fingers and it's done. It was a lot of work and took a lot of time.
I thought these guys were hungry because, at least according to my reference, it said 3 seahs was about 20 quarts of flour. That's a lot of bread.
It's, yeah.
Sarah had more than one thing in the oven, I guess.
Man, yeah. I hope everybody heard that. She had more than one thing in the oven. Yeah, so she had 33 quarts of flour to work. If each one is 11 quarts, and so
Mine says a seal is worth 7 quarts.
mine says 11. You are using that NIV thing? You're using that. You're using the ESV.
You know, I think it's funny how he states.
Okay, we'll go with yours. It was just 21, not 33. Chuck?
I think it's funny because, you know, he says, "And I will bring you a piece of bread."
Yeah, yeah.
And then, you know, then he goes and does all these things. You know, that's quite a operation there.
Yeah, and I'll just bring you a little piece of bread, a little scrap of bread.
And then he stands there while they eat. He doesn't even join.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing. He doesn't sit down and eat with them. He waits on them. He actually serves them, and so I thought that was another thing that I noticed. I'm going to look up the correct answer to that question.
Well, think about the other side of that. I mean, we think about the microwave like we were talking about. How impatient are we to somebody offers us, hey, come in, have a cup of coffee or something, and it'll take me a few minutes to make it, and we're in too much of a hurry to wait.
Yeah, yeah, we're in way too big a hurry in our society to enjoy something like this, and they just wait, sit and wait, kind of rest underneath the shade of the tree.
It says that they came in the heat of the day, so,
Yeah, they probably showed up sometime around noon or afternoon, and so this is a big time meal.
even if they just ate not long before that, by the time they got that fixed.
Yeah, if they stopped at McDonald's on the way in, they were hungry by the time they got this ready because it was a long wait. But then they ask a question, and they ask, "Where is Sarah?" And he said, "She's in the tent." And that one individual responded that he was going to be back this time next year, and Sarah would have a son. And that's when Sarah was listening, eavesdropping. Can you see her? Just kind of eavesdropping a little bit. And when she heard that, what did she do? She laughed. That was just pretty funny. And she tried to get out of it, but she couldn't because it's kind of like when Jesus was having these conversations with the Pharisees, what they were thinking. They wouldn't say it out loud. He would just respond to what they were thinking. And it says here that she laughed to herself, within herself.
Because she even thought how ridiculous it was how old her husband is.
Yeah. Here he is, and here how old I am. And the first part of verse 14 there is a key sentence to remember. And what does it say there? What does he say? And who is this speaking, by the way? That's a good question. Who does verse 13 say it is? Verse 1 says the Lord. Verse 13 says the Lord.
That's another good lesson to remember is that as old as they were, they couldn't really take the credit for it. It wasn't like they were in their childbearing years
Yeah.
and stuff like that.
No, this had gone to an extreme where it was beyond obvious that God was the one who did it. And so the three that are described as the men, but we know they're not, as they were leaving, they were looking down toward Sodom, and the Lord again says, "Shall I hide what I'm going to do from Abraham? Because he's going to be great, and all the nations are going to be great through him, and I've chosen him," and so forth. So should I really be hiding this? And so what did God tell Abraham he was going to do? What did he say had happened? The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. Anybody hear what the great state of New York has done? Legalized abortion up to delivery. They've redefined what a person is. They've legalized abortion up to the time of delivery. And you combine that with all of the things that we're seeing, the homosexuality and the transgender and so forth, you just wonder how long before God gets to the point and says the outcry is indeed great, their sin is exceedingly grave. Just how much will God put up with before he says enough is enough? I've had as much as I'm going to take.
I just keep hoping that there's someone who is seeking to be in the right relationship with him.
Yeah,
That's what I keep hoping.
and there are people, even in New York, who are appalled. There was some store owner that closed and said, "I'm not going to collect taxes to pay to a state that does something like this. I'm not going to do business and collect taxes to give them." So there are people like that, but you just wonder, how would you have enough people to even pass something like that? And so we look at Sodom and Gomorrah, and we can see how totally immoral they are, but then you look around us and you think, They didn't have anything on us. And so God indicates what's going to happen. And Abraham starts, he goes into a bargaining mode. And what does Abraham say? Yeah, you're going to sweep away the righteous with the wicked. And so how about if there are 50 righteous people in that town? Will you destroy it? Or will you save it on account of the 50? Yeah. And then he went right on down, and he got down to 10. And
Is there anything to indicate how big that area was at that time? Anything?
no, because it's been wiped out. It's not like you can find ruins of a city or something like that. I'm sure people have estimates of how big it was, but I don't know. But it was a significant area. If you see the description, when Lot chose that area, it was not a minor place.
I think it's sad that Abraham started with 50, and then as he kept thinking, he was like, that's not quite going to do it.
Yeah.
And he does get all the way down to 10.
And you wonder if he's bargaining with God or with himself. Jesse?
Yeah, but Sodom and Gomorrah, was that an overall name for one place, or is that two?
It's two different cities, but it's just kind of a region. And it's just kind of a name for that area, but it's two cities, two big cities, twin cities. And by the time he got down to 10, and God said that he would save it if there were 10 righteous people, Abraham knew by then it was time just to quit, because there weren't even going to be 10 righteous people in all of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Abraham probably knew also what kind of a place that was. And chapter 19 then has God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. It says that the two angels came to Sodom. And so out of the three, two of them are identified as the two angels, and the other one is identified as the Lord. And so the three were not just three angels. Apparently there were only two angels, and the third one was the Lord. They go into the city and are seated at the gate, and when Lot sees them, what does he do? He urges them to come to his house. Why would he do that?
Probably because he knew how wicked the city was, and he wanted to get
That was probably the primary reason, because he knew how wicked the city was. He wanted to get them off the streets.
He also had come from Abraham's household, and we see how Abraham
Yeah.
treated people.
And I think that he would have done it anyway out of hospitality, because that's just what he did. And so you put those two together, that this is what he would have done because of his background in hospitality. And we see other cases in the Old Testament where someone is going to stay in the square and someone comes up and says, no, don't do that, because it was just hospitality. And you combine that with the evilness of the people. And so he urged them strongly. They agreed, and he prepared a feast for them. He baked bread, and they ate. And at nighttime, the men of the city surround the city, the house now, both young and old, all the people from every quarter, which describes the extent of their unrighteousness. And they want Lot to send those two men out to them.
This is the part I just can't understand.
The daughter part? Yeah, the daughter part I don't understand either. It shows the extremity of hospitality, how important hospitality was. He offered them his two daughters instead. And that's awfully hard for anybody to understand, but especially a parent of a daughter to understand that. But I do think it just points out how strong that the hospitality rule was. But yeah, that part I don't understand either, why he made that particular offer. And fortunately, they were not at all interested. And then they started attacking him. Yeah, he's an outsider. He came here and he's telling us what to do. And so we'll pull you out here too. the two angels, the two men, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house, shut the door, and struck everybody blind. And they couldn't even find the door, and so they finally dissipated. The angels asked Lot, okay, who else is here? And there are the two daughters, their fiancés probably. Remember that marriage wasn't handled the same way back then as it is now, that they were considered married even before they were married, when they were betrothed. And then they would have a ceremony where the bride would be escorted from her parents' house to the new house. And so although they're described as sons-in-law or sons, they're probably fiancés of their daughters.
It's sad if every man was pressing on the door, would they not be included?
Well, apparently they were inside the house because of the question is, who else do you have here? And so they may be in the house. But why aren't they out front trying to defend either their wives or their fiancés? That would be their fiancés because of the way they're described.
Well, it's their father's house, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's their future father-in-law's house. Right, yeah. But there are a lot of questions here about why they behaved the way they did. And, why Lot did what he did, and why these two men did what they did. And Lot spoke to them, and he told them what was going to happen. And how did they respond to that?
They thought he was joking.
You're just joking, aren't you? Haha, that's really funny. God's not going to destroy this town. And if anybody would suggest today that God's going to get fed up sooner or later, the response would be, you're crazy. You're crazy. That's not going to happen. That will never happen.
Well, it goes along with that attitude of everything's going along as it always has.
Sure. And we're in charge. We're doing whatever we want to. Nobody can tell us different. And so the angels told Lot to take his wife and the two daughters and to leave. And he didn't leave. He hesitated. And so the angels had to take him by the hand and actually pull them out because God had compassion on him. And in verse 17, there are the instructions that they gave to Lot and to the ones who were fleeing. And what was it? Go to the mountains. Escape for your life. Don't stay in the valley, and do not look behind. Do not look behind you. If you do, you're going to be swept away. Here Lot decides to bargain, and he says, I'm really old, and I just don't know if I can make it over to those mountains and up the mountains. Here's this little village. If you'll just spare that village, I'll escape to there, and I'll be okay there. And so God said, okay, I'll spare that one little village, and you can escape to there. And so he went to the town of Zoar.
Back in verse 12, it also mentions sons.
It says sons, but the way the relations is where it's hard to tell. It says sons-in-law too, but it says that in verse 8, it says the two daughters had not had relations with men, and so they were engaged, but they weren't married. And so it's confused. Their language is confusing a lot of times because they'll call somebody married when they're not really actually married. When they entered into the contract, they were considered married, although they didn't live together. And so they might be called sons, they might be called sons-in-law, but it... Yeah, exactly like Mary and Joseph. When you read the stories of Mary and Joseph, sometimes it sounds that they're married, but they're really not married because he puts her away. He thinks about putting her away, which is divorcing her, but they're not even married yet. And it's that custom that they had that was really confusing because of the language. It doesn't agree with our language. And so we read somebody's son and we say, well, that's so-and-so's male child or son-in-law. He's married to the daughter, but in this case, it's kind of a confusing arrangement.
Well, in the NIV, there in verse 12,
Yeah, and that may be what it is there, that's really a question more than a statement of his family, that the angels are asking, okay, do you have any of these? Do you have any sons? Do you have any sons-in-law? Do you have any daughters? If you have anybody in your house, your family, then bring them out. So that's probably more what verse 12 says, is just listing off possible answers. It's becoming daytime. This all started at night when it got dark, just as they were getting ready for bed.
Hey, Gary,
Yes.
is there one particular reason as to why Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed, or is it a variety of things?
I think it's probably one reason is the homosexuality, and that's the only one that's indicated. I doubt that was the only thing. I doubt that there were nice, righteous people, except for that one thing.
Well, the reason I asked, and I had never heard this before until we were in Idaho and the preacher said that Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't destroyed for homosexuality, but that's what I'd always heard growing up. And he referenced Ezekiel 16, 48 through 50, and homosexuality is not listed in that verse, in those verses.
Uh-huh.
Ezekiel 16, 48 through 50.
Yeah, and I think all those things are true, were true of them. That
I kind of wonder if we've taken the narrative of what's written in Genesis and just ran with it.
I don't think so, because as I say, I don't think there was just one thing they were guilty of.
Well, no, when I say ran with it, people who are against homosexuality will use that as a reason not to be. And obviously that is a reason. It is against God's word. But that wasn't the only reason that Sodom and Gomorrah.
No, I think there are many reasons, but I think what's described in chapter 19 is pretty clear what the real problem was. That they were to that extent that everybody, young and old, no matter where they were from, this was all they cared about that night. This was all they were doing that night. And so that has to be a primary factor, because this is what precipitates everything. But I do think that they, it's like our society today. You're not going to find anybody that's deep into one sin that really aren't involved in a whole bunch of other things, because they've given up on any kind of authority. And once you give up on authority, all these things that are listed in Ezekiel are going to show up.
Well, you look at the verse 50 there, yes, they were haughty and committed abominations, and you can make out of that what you want. You can figure that what they were doing, what's mentioned there in Genesis, that would certainly fit into the
Right.
abomination part of it.
Right, there in Ezekiel 16:50, that they were haughty and committed abominations before me, therefore I removed them when I saw it. And what happens there in Genesis is one of the primary examples of what God would call an abomination, if you go back and look at the law.
Well,
That
verse 58 uses the word lewdness also. I mean, there's a lot.
lewdness, yeah, in verse 58, lewdness
That too.
and abominations.
I mean, I think, like you said, we can look at our
Yeah.
society today and we can see and we can know and understand.
Yeah,
It wasn't just one thing.
right. Back in chapter 19, God rains brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah and overthrows the whole valley and everything that was with it. But what does his wife do? She looks back and she becomes a pillar of salt. The only thing that we know for sure why she would turn into a pillar of salt, because God said not to. And we guess sometimes what might have motivated her to look back, and that was that she was longing for what was back there, or maybe she was just curious. But the bottom line is God said, do not look back. And she looked back. And so that was why she experienced what she did. In Luke chapter 17, Jesus is talking about the most likely the impending destruction of Jerusalem. And he says in Luke 17:28, it's the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. It'll be just the same on that day when the Lord of man is revealed. On that day let not the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house go down to take them away. And likewise let not the one who is in the field turn back. And so when Jerusalem is being destroyed, what he's saying is you need to look for the signs and you need to get out ahead of time. And he just makes a little statement there in verse 32 and goes on. And what does he do to drive home his point? Remember Lot's wife. And so when Jesus wants to make a point about don't tarry, don't dilly-dally, don't look back, he just says, remember Lot's wife, look at what happened to her, and goes right on. Verse 27 and following there in chapter 19 have to be sad. If you really put yourself in Abraham's shoes, just try to picture this scene as in a movie. Abraham gets up early in the morning, and what does he see? The whole valley is on fire. The whole valley is smoking. It's like the smoke from a furnace. And can you just imagine standing up there on that ridge or wherever he was and looking out over what had been described as like the Garden of Eden? That's why Lot chose it, because it was like the Garden of Eden.
Do you imagine he's sitting up there going, I made the wise choice, when he thinks back about the choice that him and Lot made years before, or where they were going to go?
It had to reinforce that when he made that choice. And I wonder if he knows what's happening to Lot. You know, if you look back when the three were there and the Lord tells them what's going to happen, I don't notice him saying, by the way, Lot's going to be okay. And so I'm also wondering if Abraham is looking down there and just has a multitude of thoughts running through his head. And one of them is, what's happened to Lot? Another one probably is, I'm glad I made the choice I did. And yeah, he probably wasn't doing it in a prideful way, but just as a reinforcing way. You look down and you see that what was obviously the right choice is having the right outcome. But he definitely did not seek the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He tried to avoid it as much as possible. As they are running toward the mountain and leaving Zoar, the two daughters think that they are the only three people left on the face of the earth. They have every reason to think that because there's nothing left. I mean, everything has been wiped out. And so they think that they are the only three that are surviving in the whole world. And so they're going to have children by their father in order to keep the human race going, or the whole human race is going to die out. And so the older daughter conceived and had a son in verse 37. What's his name? His name is Moab, and he would become the father of the Moabites. And the younger had a son, and they called him Ben-Ami, and he's the father of the Ammonites. And so these are descendants of Lot. And we'll run into the Moabites and the Ammonites as you go through the Old Testament, and these are the descendants of Lot. And so we have the descendants of Ishmael, and now we have the descendants of Lot through Moab and Ammon. if you're going to make up a story about your greatest figure in all of your history, you're not going to write chapter 20. If you're going to make it up and try to make your hero look good, you're going to forget about chapter 20. Because this is not the first time, this is the second time he's pulled this. And Abraham settles in a new area. And what does he say about Sarah? She is my sister. He pulled this in Egypt. And I don't know if you say it worked well or not down there. I mean, he got a lot of money out of it, but I don't think you can tell that God was very happy with what he pulled. And so, he tells the king there, she's my sister. God came to Abimelech at night and warned him and said, "You're a dead man." But Abimelech hadn't come near her, and so. Yeah, that was his intention. He hadn't fulfilled it. Verse 4 says he hadn't completed that, but that was absolutely his intention. And so God says, yeah, you're innocent because you did this without knowing it, and I stopped you before you carried it out. But you will notice that later on there are consequences of this. And so we need to be very careful about sin and make sure we're informed. He was lied to, but there were still consequences, and there was a big potential consequence for him, even though Abraham had lied to him. Abimelech was not a happy camper. In verse 9, he called Abraham and said, "What have you done? What did I do to you that you have done this to us? You've done something that shouldn't be done." And in verse 10, he says, "What have you encountered? What have you run into that you would do something like this?" And Abraham said, "Well, I thought since the people didn't respect God here that you might kill me because of my wife." And then verse 12, his rationalization. She really is my sister, my half-sister. She's not the daughter of my mother, but the daughter of my father. And I'm not sure how to read verse 13. It sounds a little bit to me like Adam and Eve in the garden. "The woman you gave me." In verse 13 it said, "When God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is what you need to do for me. Wherever we go, you need to say that I am your brother.'" This is a deal they worked out a long time ago. They've been operating under this plan the whole time, that whenever the situation arose, that they would say that she is his sister. What does he think is going to happen? I mean, he thinks they're going to take her to be his wife, and so he sets her up to be their wife. He just saves his own neck in the process. And so Abimelech takes sheep and oxen and servants and gives them to Abraham and gives Sarah back and says, "Here's the land, take wherever you want. I've given Sarah, he tells Sarah, "I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver to demonstrate that nothing happened." But see in verse 17, there were consequences. And even though Abimelech was lied to, in verse 17, Abraham had to pray to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maids so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. We would like to use the excuse for sin that I didn't know. I didn't know that was a sin. Abimelech couldn't have known, but it's our obligation to know what sin is. It's our duty to know what we're dealing with. And ignorance is not going to be an excuse before God. "Well, so-and-so told me that it would be okay." Well, so-and-so didn't know the right answer. So in chapter 21, unless chapter 20 is stuck out of place, and sometimes they rearrange things, unless chapter 20 is out of place, we have an 89-year-old pregnant woman that this is happening to, right? If it's in order, because the promise has been made in chapter 21, she has a child. Maybe she didn't conceive till after this, which makes me think that chapter 20 may be out of order some way.
Well, and God is keeping his promise that he made to Abraham.
Yeah, God keeps all the promises that he made to them. And so she does have a child, just as God had appointed, and they called him Isaac. And it says Abraham was 100 years old. And in chapter 21, verse 6, this time Sarah can get away with it. What's her reaction now? God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears me will laugh with me. Yeah, laugh for me, will enjoy this. Who would have said that Abraham and Sarah would have children at this age? There is a growing tension between Sarah and Hagar. And in verse 9 there, Sarah sees Ishmael apparently mocking Isaac. He's mocking something. Now he is a teenager. Back in chapter 17, he was 13 years old, so he'd be about 14 years old now. And he is mocking, and so she turns to Abraham, and what does she say to him? Get rid of them. Get rid of the two of them. They cannot be here with my son Isaac. Abraham was not happy about this. He was not eager to send, and this is his son. He's not eager to send him away.
For anybody that has had teenagers, when you think that you've run into something unique with teenage problems, it was back in Abraham's time.
Yeah, clear back then, this teenager's, and he may have just been acting like a teenager, but Sarah didn't take it that way. God promises that he will also take care of Ishmael, that he will be made a great nation because he is a descendant of Abraham. And so Abraham puts together provisions, bread and water, and gives them to Hagar and sends them away. When the water runs out, what does she do? She puts him underneath the bush, and she goes a ways away, and she just didn't want to have to witness him dying. And she's weeping, and God hears the child crying, and the angel comes and said, "What's the matter with you? Don't fear. God has heard the voice of the lad." And again, the promise that God will make a great nation from him. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and filled the skin with water, and gave him a drink, and then they went on. And she found a wife for him from Egypt. This King Abimelech that he had deceived this last time recognized that God was with Abraham, that it was a good thing to have Abraham around. He makes a deal with Abraham. He doesn't want Abraham to try to deceive him or his descendants. And so Abraham swears that he will not deceive them. Abraham had dug a well, and the servants of Abimelech had taken it, had seized it, and so Abraham complained to him, and they worked out another pact to recognize that Abraham had dug the well. And what do they call the place? Beersheba. Sheba is the word for seven. And Beer is the word for wells, and so Beersheba means 7 wells. And here again, Abraham plants a tree in verse 33 and calls on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. So here again, he worships God and stays there in the land of the Philistines for many days. Okay, well, I'll just save chapter 22 for next week, I guess. We can't rush through chapter 22, I don't think, with the sacrifice of Isaac. And I want to take a look at some of these questions at the end of the paper there about the importance of hospitality to God. You saw Abraham and his hospitality. You saw Lot and his hospitality. The New Testament really makes a big deal about hospitality too. So there's some other lessons I want to get out of this one before we go on to the next one next time.